Hi, and welcome to Rule of Carnage. My name is Glenn Ford, and I am here with Mike Hutchinson.
Hi.
Hi, we're a couple of game designers and developers, and we're here talking about designing better miniatures games. And the subject that we're going to have a little chat about today is psychology, not player psychology, which is a whole different subject we might get onto at some other point, but rather the psychology of your minis and your units and the guys on the tabletop.
The facial expressions of your toy soldiers.
Yes, how a game simulates what's going on with them in such a way as to get them to refuse to do what you want them to do. Because a lot of war games and skirmish games represent situations that are psychologically unpleasant for the combatants, and a lot of them choose to represent that by having them act in a way that is awkward and difficult and unpredictable and not what you wanted them to do. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the common sort of breakdowns of where what could be referred to as sort of psychology for the tabletop occurs. Talk a little bit about the mechanics, the pros and the cons, and at some point maybe why it is that Mike doesn't ever have it in any of his games. So what I think of as psychology are rules that cause a player's models to act or move unpredictably. So mechanically, it's generally something happens that usually results in a disordered, uncontrolled, and unpredictable state for the minis themselves. And for the sake of, go on.
I was just going to say, just to quibble on one of the parts of that definition. So I think unpredictability is a big part, but in some cases we will talk about it's predictable, but it's sort of out of your control, and therefore maybe hands the control, the reins to the other player. But certainly about the unreliability of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at some point later on when we get through this conversation a bit more, there are ranges of the nature of the broken state or the psychologically affected state of the minis in question, and I think there's a rainbow of where you can go through and advantages and disadvantages to how extreme that is. So for the sake of categorization, which is a wonderful and splendid thing, I've chosen to refer to these rules as breaking down into 5 basic categories. So there's fear, which is where your unit or model acts in an unusual way because it has interacted with another model that has a state or an ability or a rule that affects them. So the classic example is that thing is scary, your model fears it, and so when you want your model to attack it, it refuses to do so. The second is what we might call panic, which is where an event within the game causes your model to act unpredictably. Again, the classic is half their unit gets wiped out by a massive fireball, they get upset, and so they run away in a direction you don't want them to. There's what I'd call the general term of refusal, which is where a unit won't do what you want them to because of an inherent quality within that unit. So a unit that might be stupid or badly trained or something of that nature, where you go, okay, I want it to move from here to there, and you check and it says, no, we won't do that, we're just going to stand here for no particularly good reason. There's the whole section of break tests, which is its own whole thing that results in sort of unpredictable and unfortunate behavior on units that fail a break test. And then there is what we might categorize as other, which are the things like frenzy and blood fury, and usually it tends to be because a particular unit is impetuous, yeah, problematic, and so they'll do weird things. Sometimes it can be because a particular unit is very traitorous and will turn around and shoot its allies or switch
or has
sides.
some particular enmity against some other model or unit.
Yeah, and there's a whole sort of catch bag of little bits and pieces and characterful whatnots in there. So we might talk a little bit maybe at first about maybe each of those categories and, you know, what's useful about them and how you can leverage them a little bit. So starting with fear, As I say, that's a general term for anything where someone can buy an ability for one model, which gives them, and this is what's interesting about it, a passive sort of buff. Fear as a psychological effect on one model is almost always a passive reward that causes every other model to act problematically around it. And it grades up through things like basically just causing, as I say, I use the categories from Warhammer, but there are a whole bunch of effects that have different names and work in different ways across a wealth of games. But for example, in Warhammer, you've got fear and you've got terror. And fear just stops people from running up and hitting you. Terror means that you get to stand next to them and have a pulse aura that makes them run away. And they're very powerful effects, because anything that's passive that you buy once and just affects pretty much everything or a lot of things throughout the game is always a powerful thing to leverage within a game. So I think it's a common thing to have, and possibly the most common of all of these psychological effects, which is odd in a way because it's one of the most game affecting and balance altering powers that you can give a unit in a game.
Yeah, I mean, with perhaps the acceptance of break tests, which I think is the most common here. I think it's interesting. It's interesting to hear you define it as both passive and likely, aura based. Potentially not always aura based, but yeah, that's interesting. So, because there are lots of other mechanical effects that will work similarly to this. Here, we're trying to talk about psychology and kind of unreliability of troops, which this is a mechanic that you could also use for, like, essentially you could use this as like to represent the strength of the armor, or like, some kind of terrain effect. But here the same mechanical apparatus is useful to represent the sort of the aura of psychological impact of, like, I don't want to be here, I don't want to go nearer to that, but it's also interesting to hear you separate that from active or like event response, because to hear the sort of fear thing initially, I'd be thinking of reactions to models effects that, like, thematically are trying to scare a model or influence their judgment, kind of like mind control, or like pulling a face off or something. But those are, I think, in your categorization, all kind of panic effects. So I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. If an effect is on for the entire game and passive, and then subsequently, and this might vary by the specific mechanic that is being written, if it's in some way automatic or just always in effect and doesn't have to be tested for, then of course all of those things add up to an incredibly powerful effect when we're analyzing models and so forth. Like, the number of times that a particular special effect comes into play during a game is obviously a key factor in rating how important and powerful and impactful it's going to be.
Yeah, and I think like I say, I think when a unit sort of jumps up and triggers an ability, and there are various rule sets where things like fear and terror come from someone triggering or the terrifying thing doing something actively and then popping another unit out of activation into doing something. Like I say, here I've sort of suggested that that's categorized more like, I've chosen to term that panic, because it's just simply to categorize things out into the psychology where your unit does something and it interacts with the scary thing versus the scary thing occurring and it popping all the things around it. Like I say, sometimes it's going to be fear that pops like panic, and sometimes it's going to be, something named panic which occurs like fear. So don't take these terms for these categories as being representative of any given system. These are sort of terms that I've chosen as out of convenience. But
no, I think it's good. I think one thing that's interesting though is that the term you've chosen is negative, and I think there's a perfectly reasonable definition that includes like inspiration stuff, like stuff that is interaction with friendly units rather than enemy units. And so a sort of passive bubble effect could be, the inspiring presence of a character or a general or a leader, which is providing some kind of buff rather than debuff effect, which, obviously this cuts to a little bit of the discussion about how much of these effects are for mechanical impact and how much of these effects are for narrative impact. But a leadership buff from a hero, this is to sort of represent the shining leader and the big speech and all this sort of stuff that's very cinematic.
But of course the positive effects and buffs within psychology, the result of them tends to be that psychology doesn't happen.
Could be, yeah.
It's quite rare that you have a positive buff that causes your units to act in an unpredictable way. It's one of the reasons that that something like frenzy is an interesting sort of category out. And it is interesting that so many of these categories are negatives. And I think it speaks to what we were saying in our last conversation about the fact that losing control is almost always a negative thing to happen to you. I
suppose one of the things underneath this that sort of sits maybe aside from the unpredictability is that psychology rules to a degree are trying to capture like the human element. Like you've zoomed out on a war game to some kind of fairly at least tactical but potentially strategic level, and so your little toy soldiers, they're not real people, you can push them around, they die, they bad stuff happens to them, and psychology is one of the places where you can try and reconnect the player to the little tiny narrative that's happening on the table, and so in that regard, like although the positive effects, the buffs, don't necessarily lead to unpredictability or they cancel out some of the negative things, I think they are serving a human desire, a narrative desire to sort of connect with the little human stories that are happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason I've chosen to refer to these various effects as psychology, as opposed to unpredictability mechanisms or something like that, is that they are, and we can start sort of talking about this part of the conversation now, is that they exist for, I think, at least they were created for largely simulationist reasons.
Right.
It's an attempt to say, okay, we know that in reality, troops run away from horrible things that happen. And that while we have charges of the Light Brigade, for the most part, people will refuse to do completely suicidal things or things that they perceive from their perspective as completely suicidal.
Or the level of inspiration and commitment will start high, and then the sort of grim reality will overtake people's higher functions, and the lizard brain takes over.
Yeah, and the number of times as a tabletop commander we go, okay, well, here's unit definite sacrifice, my speed bump. You guys go stand out here, and it's like so obviously they're so obviously being said to their immediate death.
There should be a sort of universal chaff refusal test where it's like, I send my chaff unit out, and the chaff unit just goes, no, we're off to make a sandwich because this is not what I signed up for.
What am I doing, Chief? Well, you see that bloodthirster. Well, our only opportunity against it is for it to turn its flank, right? So I'm going to be the guy who runs to its flank. No,
no, Sonny.
Go forth. I really don't want to. Well, tough. You haven't been panicked yet. You have to do exactly what I say. It's so obvious. Yeah, and I think that the root of them is primarily sort of simulationist. It's to try and make what happens on the tabletop realistic to what happens in life, rather than inherently to make it sort of mechanically interesting. And games designers, being what they are, have gone from, okay, it was a narrative thing telling a story where it went, what happens in real life, your soldiers just won't do what you tell them to and have their own ideas, and certain sorts of players went around playing that going, oh, this is splendid, I'm not having any control over what's happening. Oh, look at that, you went off into completely different.
We talked about this a little bit in a previous episode, which I slipped my mind what specific conversation this came up, but that, like, I think it might have been about the impulse for victory, like the difference between I'd like to set this set of clockwork up and then let go and see where the little clockwork mice end up and have a jolly time, sort of with emergent fun. I don't mean emergent fun. I mean like the thing that's going to happen is only barely within my control. And to a degree, there's an element of that in Gaslands where it's like you don't always know where everything's going to end up, versus something that's much closer to like, okay, it's a test of skill, test of tactical acumen between two players, and there's low variance in the stuff that's going to happen. And I suppose that like abstraction, but the difference between abstraction and simulation isn't the same line as low variance and high variance, but they are quite correlated in practice.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think it's really, really interesting, because thinking about this subject prior to this conversation, as I understand it, in the sort of history of war games, when they first came about, there wasn't anything that we would now recognize as psychology. There weren't sort of leadership tests and troops refusing to do what they were told to do. The troops marched into where you told them to do and fought effectively and then died. And then psychology came in, and then it felt like every game, every unit there had to be psychology effects. There had to be reactions to terrifying events and things running away, and there was a sort of peak point, I think, where a lot of games came to about halfway point, and then everything on the tabletop just...
You're sort of talking about late 70s into the 80s.
Yeah, and I think
the early 90s.
I think there was a peak point where all games, your models came out, and then they decided what they were going to do irrespective of your opinion, and then they did them, and then you looked at the chaos that was left at the end of the game and counted up, and it turned out you'd won. But largely it was because you'd, in the first couple of turns, set the clockwork dinosaur going in the right direction, rather than because you tinked it all the way through. And now I think there's much more of a fashion for a lot of newer games to cut out psychology and what we'd recognize as psychological effect by and large. I mean, I mentioned on here before how, for example, Malifaux in its first edition had a very sort of perfunctory fear effect that you had to really go out of your way to leverage to get any particular use out of it. And then it just went, you know what, we're just out and out junking it, we're just not having it. And more and more new games I'm seeing just aren't bothering with significant psychological effects. Even sort of massed battle rank and flank games are easing off on it a lot more than I would have expected. It's like Saga really doesn't have psychology effects. As I understand it, Lion Rampant, it has sort of break tests, but not the way you'd recognize.
Lion Rampant's one of that stable of things, which I think is still fairly prevalent, of unreliable activations.
Yeah, and it certainly has. You suffer a psychological effect, and then you have negatives put upon you, so that in future you won't work as effectively as you would have done without them.
I mean, one of the things could be that, like, smaller games, the impacts of smaller model count games, the impact of psychology is greater. If something doesn't do what it's told, that's a greater proportion of your force that isn't doing what it's told. And then maybe so maybe there's a correlation there. But equally, I think a lot of games design at the moment in miniatures is trying to fight down the duration of time spent playing games, making games faster, and that they end quicker so that you can play another game. And so I think potentially removing some of that unpredictability and walking in the wrong direction it's a direct or it's an indirect response to, like, how do I take a 4-hour game and make it a 2-hour game? Well, let's not spend half of the game walking in the wrong direction. Let's try taking that part out.
But I mean, the irony, and I don't think that's untrue, but the irony, of course, is that, say, for example, in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, psychology massively speeds that game up, because
that is true. Yeah, in
the
terms
number
of the
of
break
actual,
test and the collapsing of armies.
yeah, the number of actual troops you physically batter with a hammer until they're dead in a game of Warhammer versus the number of troops you take off are vastly uneven in number. And the most effective armies in Warhammer have always been armies that can leverage psychology. Demons of Chaos, when you could sort of mass affect somebody's leadership and then plonk a terror causing monster in the middle of their army, you could just break an entire army 2 turns into a game and go, there we go, brilliant. If you want, we can re-rack and do that again, or we can just, accept that it'll keep happening.
Another hypothesis, again, I don't know the intent behind all of these things, but like there's a seam of rules which, for example, Battlefleet Gothic is one example of this, where in order to do something cooler with your unit, you need to take a command check or a leadership check. So you can do your normal move and shoot, but if you want to do something cooler, you have to make a command check. It's made it forward into the 2018 Adeptus Titanicus as well. And to a degree, like it's possible to take a step back from that mechanic and go, wait, so I could do something cool, but you're going to give me an opportunity to do less cool things. Like why not just give me more toys rather than fewer toys? Is that command check actually introducing enough interesting decision making to warrant the loss of fun of not being allowed to do those things? So potentially as well, to a degree, like games design is getting a little bit more, we talked about it on a previous episode, but like providing things which push the game forward rather than restricting and denying things. And to a degree, some implementations of psychology can very much be that. Your fear effect is I can't do the thing I was looking to do. My troop refusal effect is I can't do the thing I was trying to do. My break test effect is I've completely lost that unit and I can do nothing further with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a certain amount of its reduction is to do with the fact that if you've got a full set of psychology rules, you want things moving around the table under psychology rules, and psychology rules are genuinely quite ambiguous for movement. If you take Warhammer says you break a unit to a skirmish and then it points in that rough direction and it moves in that rough fashion. And as soon as you're doing that, it's like, oh, well, is that guy going to move like an inch this way? Because if he does, I'll be able to charge him and possibly break the entire unit. And if you've got a quite sort of loosey-goosey attitude towards the game you're playing, that's all fine and dandy. Once things start getting a bit crunchier and tighter, people get more and more upset. And writing, because ultimately broken units that move around the battlefield are moving around the battlefield under AI conditions, and writing tight, clean AI movement rules on a random bits and pieces tabletop we tend to play these games on is absolutely backbreakingly difficult. And I think personally, from a sort of game designer's perspective, I think it might be easing off in fashionability because a desire to move away from that ambiguity. I also think part of it is down to the non-massed unit combats that we see in alternating activation games that are becoming more popular, and those moving away from the fashionability of break tests. But we'll sort of maybe come around to talking back about that in a second. We'll just run very quickly over these categories to have a few more words about each of them. So we talked about fear. So we've got panic, which is more about an event occurring which causes everybody around that event to react to it in a particular way. And as I say, that's different.
It could be a targeted effect as well. It could be, you lose.
It tends to be that something pops and things whose turn it is not get affected by the popping. There might also things whose turn it is get affected by the popping, but generally it's I pop this, everybody gets affected by it, whether or not they would normally activate, and then they activate out of activation. And again, I think this is one of the reasons that possibly psychology effects are reducing in popularity, because it forces interrupt conditions, and interrupt conditions create sort of slightly annoying knock-on effects for rules writing reasons. Um, and then we've got, as I say, this sort of refusal psychology. And I think this is the one that's mainly what you were talking about it being it tends to be a switch off ability. It tends to be, you want to say to that unit, will you please do this? And that unit says no. And again, I think it'd be really interesting to have a conversation about activation systems, because I think that units refusing to do what you told them to was extremely popular at one point. And it's where games like War Master sometimes feels a little bit of a hangover from another era, because in it repeatedly your models just go, no, I'm just not going to do that. No, refuse to. And I really think that sort of refusal to do what you told
it might just be a very British way of writing miniature games. Just a really curmudgeonly, bloody-minded.
Grog. All of your troops are just grog.
Oh, dare to put me on a top on a dare to put me on a tabletop and try and play with me. I'll show you, sunshine.
I do not, Gov. No way. I think that is one I feel that has very much dropped out of fashion. For that reason, that people, like I say, don't like having things turned off. Then I think as I say, there's the bucket of other things like fury and mind control and weird abilities that you generally pay for, and they, I think, they just tend to be things that throw in weird chaos to the tabletop and do something interesting and peculiar, and tend to have their own little rule sets. And then and then there's breaking. Now, I think break tests definitely come from an era of historic gaming, because if you have even the most passing interest in historical warfare, it's by and large decided by things breaking, the line of battle breaking, when put under pressure. And the idea of, I think, historical wargaming not at some point attempting to represent that in a rule set was always going to be, well, no, that's the first thing we have to do. The first thing we have to do is simulate the point where a line breaks. That's the most important thing. Everything else is secondary to that. And I think sometimes I feel like, and then they went, okay, so now that we have this line break moment, we've got these rules that show what happens when something breaks and loses control and runs about all over the tabletop. We've got these rules. Well, we may as well create a design space for those rules where other things cause you to act the way you did when you broke, but without you actually breaking. And I don't know, that always feels to me like it's sort of the loop of the first creation of psychology. And I think what's interesting is that because alternating activation games seem to have moved away from ongoing combats that you get locked into, that you break from, that involve multiple combats, I think that break tests themselves are slightly falling out of favor. Like I say, Saga is a great example where units fighting Saga, and they just have a gentlemanly back away of about an inch or so at the end of the combat and go, well, jolly good show, chaps. Now my friends shall fight you. Friends! And the friends run in and fight them, and they have a little bash, and they back away an inch or two and go, oh, jolly good. Might your friends now fight me? I think they should. I mean, I
think kind of from where I'm sitting, I think that it's very much, again, about the tendency towards abstraction versus simulation. So a lot of games are, Age of Sigmar is one, Sludge is another, where instead of literally representing troops running away by turning the miniatures around and having them run away, you simply take them off the battlefield. You say, they've gone to ground, they've fled the battlefield, they might be still somewhere on the tabletop, but their contribution to this battle is over. They're of no consequence anymore, so simply remove the miniature. I think that's a very common solution to this problem that's used at the moment, because rolling a dice to find out whether your troops have broken, and then doing one of two things, either taking a couple of models off or moving an entire unit and measuring things and checking that it's in the right place and seeing what happens afterwards. Like, there's a big additional cost to that. And in some games, whether that's a mass battle or whether it's a skirmish game, like where that model ends up and can it turn back around and can it then contribute differently, like there is interesting design space there. Like I don't think that's an invalid question for your game to be asking, but at the same time, there's a big cost versus just taking a couple of models over and rushing to the end of the battle where, do you know what, things are broken, and that means there's just not very many miniatures left to mess about with. And so rather than controlling 2 or 3 unbroken units and then having to like AI a bunch of disordered rubbish at the back, why don't we just ignore all of that, get to this bit, you know, have one fewer cup of tea and re-rack for the next game. And I think that abstraction versus simulation is a design objective. It's something that, you know, if I, you know, when I'm writing Hobgoblin, I've got a very abstract mindset, but it's perfectly reasonable to want to approach a mass battle game or a skirmish game in a way what's like, no, actually what I'm trying to do is enjoy the moments of movement of these troops, explore where they go, like, you know, have a bit more playing to find out and a bit less playing to win sort of focus. So I think it's all very much choosing the tool for the narrative or game purpose job that you've got at hand.
Absolutely. And I don't know why or where. I don't, you know, I it's only my feel that I think the fashion has sort of changed. But if it has changed, I think that it's been because of a shift in what people are wanting from the game, the motivations to create the game, the stories you're trying to tell. I think that there was a point where, okay, well, what I'm trying to do on this tabletop is I'm trying to do something that acts in the way that, say, Battle of Hastings 1066 happened. There was a line, and the line was invincible, and then someone did something foolish and broke the line, and once the line broke, it cascaded out and chaos ensued. And now I must do something that creates that. And in many ways, it's like I say, it's that sort of playing to find out, where if you've got 2 players who want to line up their troops, meet in the middle, and then have somebody, and neither of them really minds who, break, and then their battle line cascade across the tabletop like a house of cards being knocked over, a domino being flicked down, and both of you get to go, oh, now that one's breaking because of the panic of their friends running through them, and that's going to mean that they're going to get run down by them, and the savagery, and the massacre, and the pageantry of it. You know, then you want lots and lots of break tests, and you don't want to take a model off when it breaks, because watching how it runs and how it gets run down is 90% of why you're playing the game.
Yeah, it's part of that theater, and it would take away to abstract it into, well, you know, he runs away.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally.
The climactic moment of the battle is when your troops are fleeing and being run down left, right, and center, and the savagery of the massacre then occurs. Whereas, if what you're doing is playing a game to find out who is best at this game, and we're all very serious, it's like, well, they're running, they're done, they're tactically irrelevant to me. Let's just, you know.
Also, as you say, I don't want to write an AI system for them.
That too. I mean, a lot of competitive players I've played, when something is running, have gone, you know what, I know I could rally it, but I'll just take it off.
Right.
It's just going to be easier for all of us, because it's irrelevant to the strategy and the tactics. It's spent as a force. I'll just save everybody some time and remove it. Okay, so that's you've
gotten to the bottom of the list almost. There's the grab bag still to go.
Yeah, we haven't. Yeah, I haven't really heavily gone into the grab bag, because it is a grab bag. But we'll have a little talk about that before signing off on this half of the conversation. So the reason for the sort of hanging chads of psychology, I think, are almost always because psychology is sometimes just funny. It's just funny to have your things acting in a slightly whacked out, weird way, and it's certainly funny and fun and powerful to have your guy go, aha, I have the stick of wabba wabba, now your guys do baloney dance, and I didn't know I was gonna have to do a baloney dance. And a lot of what constitutes other, I think, sometimes fall into that category of not zany per se, but
it's descriptive. It's stuff where it's like you you know that the Norse berserkers need to do a berserker thing, and like they're very characterful and iconic about doing that, and you want them to do something like that, or you want the, you know, you want the craven, like cowardly rat people to do the cowardly rat people thing. And so it's very natural, I think, as you're writing rules, to try and go, well, okay, I've got a, in the bell curve of unit types, I've got rules that describe the most of, you know, whether they're high quality soldiers, or, you know, quite green new guys, or I've got, like, you know, the way that a legendary warrior will stride across the battlefield isn't that far different from the way that the squire will stride across the battlefield. But then on the edges of this bell curve, you've got like, but it just doesn't describe, you know, the mad chain wielding, you know, drug-addled biker that I really want to include as part of this setting, or similar. So yeah, I think they're probably places where you're making a value balance between additional rules and additional flavor and fun. And, you know, through playtesting, you'll figure out, you know what, the berserker rules, they're funny, but they're just adding too much overhead, and we don't really need them, and they fit okay with the normal moving and combat rules. Yeah. Or you're deciding, you know what, I really do need these special unpredictability, impetuousness rules. I mean, I'm thinking of this grab bag predominantly as impetuousness rules, but are there other things that are in your mind? Because kind of like, you know, stupidity fits into refusal, you know, cravenness and cowardliness sort of fits into refusal.
I think that the main other thing that fits in, I think that the grab bag tends to be rage-filled losing control and rushing off after things, and sometimes things that aren't particularly enemy combatants. And the other main thing you tend to see there is some form of infighting, betrayal,
right,
you know, backbiting, squabbling. So again, like I say, referring back to Warhammer, just because it's a thing that everyone is aware of, orcs and goblins squabble because they're just a sort of belligerent bunch of, you know, football hooligans, and they will stop and punch each other in the head for a minute or two, and that is absolutely sort of peak psychological sort of out of controlness. Whereas Khorne warriors will obviously sometimes run off after somebody, but they will only do it in order to slaughter an enemy for the good of Khorne, because they so like to kill.
What one thing on this, actually, because it's thinking across all the games I played, I'm not certain I've seen this too much, but viewers, Glenn and I played quite a lot of Arkham Horror, the card game, and like target selection and target priority, or like target rejection, is maybe an underdeveloped area of psychology here. Perhaps it's not psychology, I'm not sure, but like, you know, a dwarf that always goes for whatever goblin he can see first, or a, you know, a troll that's always avoids anything burning that it can see. Like, there's not a huge amount of that stuff, and maybe it's just because it's too complicated, but I think target priority and target depriority is kind of interesting.
Well, this is why I'd say this is sort of the grab bag area, because so for example, in Warhammer you've got Slanesh magic, and Slanesh magic has a spell where you cast it on somebody and then you put a little token on the table, and then they have to move towards that little token because it is the thing of their greatest lovely desire, and it's some sort of shiny goodness that they deeply want. And there's obviously, that's a psychology moment as we've defined it, as something acting in a way that you have no control over. It's very simulationist, etc. It's literally a paragraph of rules that refers to only that spell and only that situation, and nothing else ever outside that anywhere in the game, and you never do that for anything else. And that's why it's a total sort of grab bag out thing. And yeah, I think there's lots of teeny tiny examples of this. You know, oh, you're forced to run after that thing. There's certainly, they used to be a Vampire Count's character that made people fall in love with her, and so they had to move towards her. One of the lady vampires used to do that. So they're dotted out and around, and there are certainly ones that make you pick out a particular person or move towards a particular point, but they're so random and stepped out that, like I say, it's just, you know, it's kooky weirdness for the good of the game. Okay, so that's sort of running through the basic categories. We'll I think wrap up this conversation here, and we'll come back and maybe talk a little bit more about the benefits and negatives of putting these things into a game.
Yeah, and answer the basic question of do you need them?
Yeah, do you, Mike? So we will come back to that conversation in just a little while, but for now we'll sign off on this chat. If you've watched through to this point, I assume you enjoyed some part of our ramblings. If you did, please like and subscribe. If not, or if there are psychology effects in that grab bag that you'd like us to talk more about, if there's just, you know, interesting points within game psychology that you would like to open up, if you think we've got it wrong or I've got it wrong about the change in fashion of psychology and break tests, please give us your opinion on what is or isn't happening within the hobby. Drop a comment in the comment section. We'll love to see them. I love to respond to them. But for now, look us up on social media, and we'll be back for another episode of For All the Carnage in just a minute. All right, so
Bye-bye.
bye.